Everybody loves a classic underdog story, the rush of seeing someone defy the odds, wrestle with their inner demons, and emerge victorious hits us where it counts. In the world of bodybuilding, few stories capture the thrilling ride like the one of Lee Priest. Because he was the guy who didn't fit the cookie-cutter image of what a top-tier bodybuilder should be. He was different, smaller in stature but overflowing with heart, discipline, and undeniable passion for the sport. And because of that, he grew to become a giant killer in the bodybuilding scene. And not only that, he also outperformed and placed higher than many larger bodybuilders. But like every great underdog story, Lee's rise was incredible, but his fall, brutal.
Being a bodybuilding historian and Lee, one of the newest guys on the scene, I know he appreciates what you've done for the sport.
This is the story of how Lee Priest climbed to the top, lost it all, and still found a way to fight back. It was the mid to late 90s, and the stories about bodybuilder Lee Priest were off the charts. Wild speculation ran rampant, from his personal life to steroid use, and the explosive blowouts that seemed to follow him wherever he went. In spite of it all, he was still a major force. Standing at just 5 feet 4 inches, Lee Priest was a powerhouse of muscle, one of the biggest pound-for-pound bodybuilders around. He burst onto the scene as one of the sport's youngest pros and was hailed for having some of the best arms in bodybuilding history. The reasons behind a young man's decision to pick up that first weight are many, but the spark that drives that obsession for muscles is even more intriguing. Comic book superheroes have always been about living out adolescent power fantasies, and for kids in the 80s, dealing with the pain of a family divorce often led them to cling to these larger-than-life characters. Heroes like He-Man, with their exaggerated muscles, were designed to boost self-worth and a sense of empowerment, something that Lee Priest felt deeply. For Lee, the iron promised the same kind of power during those turbulent times. Those steroid-pumped action figures didn't just look tough, they drew a clear line between good and evil. When the villains attacked, He-Man fought back. Lee's fascination with Superman followed, with his mom fueling his obsession by making him homemade costumes. While He-Man was an aspirational figure, Superman stood for morality and fairness, a clear marker of right and wrong, and an undeniable icon of masculinity. Their father was really gay.
That their father was really gay.
Years later, Lee discovered the truth about his father's sexuality and the real reason behind his parents' divorce. According to Lee, this revelation was the true spark that drove him into bodybuilding. Though Lee often brushes off this pivotal event with a casual attitude, his mother and sister said that the lingering effects of schoolyard bullying had a deep, lasting impact on his psyche. The taunting and the hurt he went through.
The taunting and the hurt that he went through.
A teacher told me, "Oh, your son, I don't like him at all."
The teacher told me, "Oh, your son, I don't like him at all."
Everyone at school was calling Lee a faggotin, and at school he was in trouble all the time. He was the class clown.
Everyone at school was calling Lee a faggot, and school, he was in trouble all the time. He was the class clown.
For a young guy growing up in the tough, macho culture of 1980s Australia, with all its quirks and blatant homophobia, the emotional fallout was impossible to ignore. After his biological father turned his back on him, he disowned him because he changed his name to Priest.
His father disowned him because he changed his name to Priest.
Lee's grandfather Owen stepped up, providing much-needed support and encouragement. Lee's grandfather was into lifting, and their shared love of lifting weights became a huge part of Lee's life. And just like the superheroes he admired, Lee seemed destined to become something special. His true gift for bodybuilding showed early on, and he attacked his training with a single-minded focus. Lee's rebellious nature quickly became apparent as he challenged everything from pointless school rules to rigid Sunday school teachings. Authority figures became obstacles to overcome, and he soon dropped out of school to throw himself into his training. Lee's passion for bodybuilding turned professional, though he struggled with the performative side of the sport. Despite his natural shyness, he made a huge impact, crushing the egos and dreams of older, more experienced competitors. By the age of 16, he had one of the best physiques in Australia, winning national titles. Yet, the pro card he deserved remained out of reach. The Australian arm of the IFBB, running the sport like a petty dictatorship, claimed he was too young for a pro card, no matter how impressive his physique was. And Lee was about to learn the hard way about the corrupt politics and biased judging that plagued the sport, where hard-working athletes like him were often sacrificed on the altar of ego and corruption. Despite passing every drug test with flying colors before the 1990 Mr. Universe competition, Lee Priest was blindsided by the sleazy promoter. He wrongfully claimed that Lee had failed the drug test and conveniently lost the B sample. Lee's attempts to clear his name with the Australian IFBB were met with silence, his pleas falling on deaf ears. The media painted him as a drug cheat, and in a fit of despair, Lee turned to self-harm, trying to make sense of the betrayal that had shattered his world. This betrayal only fueled Lee's growing disdain for figures like Goodman and showed the increasingly cutthroat nature of the Australian bodybuilding scene. But then came Ed Connors, the visionary co-owner of Gold's Gym, who saw something special in Lee.
Who was the freakiest bodybuilder or who impressed you the most in Golds? And I'm thinking, oh my God, how many people have been through Golds? And when Ed said my name, I thought, screw winning a Mr. Ed.
Connors provided Lee with a roof over his head, financial support, and important connections in the sport. He often declared that Lee was the greatest bodybuilder he had ever encountered, freakiest you would say. Lee's journey to the top of bodybuilding turned from a brief American visit into an 18-year saga. Initially driven by false promises, Lee found a genuine ally in Connors, who also introduced him to Joe Weider, adding Lee to his prestigious roster. Even though the pay was modest, it was a start, and Lee finally snagged that coveted pro card. Stepping into the 1990s bodybuilding scene was both thrilling and daunting for him. Lee moved on from the circus-like atmosphere of Gold's Gym, where celebrity spotting had become more of a distraction than a benefit. The established pros, sensing a threat from the new kid on the block, made the environment unwelcoming. Lee then settled into World's Gym, where the old-school vibe and custom equipment matched his philosophy of hitting the weights hard and eating big. The 90s were on the brink of a bodybuilding revolution, with mass monsters like Yates shaking up the sport. The once celebrated classical look was being taken by extreme physiques that pushed the boundaries of human aesthetics. And Lee, he was all in on this new era. He wanted to be as shocking and awe-inspiring as the freaks dominating the scene. Fans flocked to see the extremes, and Lee was more than happy to deliver, embodying the wild new wave of bodybuilding with every flex and pose. After turning heads at the 1994 Arnold Classic, Ironman Pro, Night of Champions, Lee Priest asked Joe Weider for a pass on the upcoming Houston show so he could focus on the Olympia. The request was granted, but Lee couldn't dodge the tricky politics of the IFBB. He got hit with a year-long suspension for a supposed breach of contract, and IFBB Vice President Wayne D'Amelia claimed they hadn't heard a peep from him. Lee eventually paid the fine, got his suspension lifted, and kept pushing forward. The 1995 season saw Lee hitting his stride. Unlike today's pampered pros, 90s bodybuilders really had to earn their keep, competing in a slew of shows. Lee became a solid fixture in the spotlight, celebrated for his old-school training, no bullshit attitude, and brutally honest remarks. With nicknames like Giant Killer, Blonde Myth, and Pocket Yates, he was definitely on the rise. But Lee wasn't about to stay quiet about the IFBB's shady treatment of athletes. The Federation's brutal schedules and utter disregard for competitors' well-being had him fuming. How many backstage collapses and near-death incidents would it take for the IFBB to actually care about its athletes? Yet, despite the mounting problems and evidence, the Federation kept on with its smoke and mirrors politics. Then came the 1997 Olympia, where Lee's 5th place was mysteriously downgraded to 6th, all because of Kevin Levrone whining. With no real incentive to play the game, Lee's frustration with the IFBB's incompetence and apathy only grew. After a punishing 10-show run in 1997, Lee Priest ditched Wider for ProLab, a move others claimed could tank his future, but really, it exposed the rotten core of the industry's favoritism. Meanwhile, bodybuilders like Kickinger and Champ were raking in $20,000 to $30,000 more than Lee despite having worse placements. It was a blatant insult. Lee didn't keep his mouth shut. He blasted the industry by writing an article calling out how athletes were getting screwed left and right. They had zero control over their image, were forced into promotional gigs and magazine covers for no pay, and faced fines up to $110,000 if they didn't comply. The message was loud and clear: shut up and do as you're told. While others stayed silent, Lee poured his focus into the 1998 Olympia. With Dorian Yates out of the picture, the top spot was wide open, and everyone was buzzing about the new era. The IFBB announced this would be the first Olympia drug tested for diuretics, causing panic among the contenders. Yet, when the smoke cleared and Coleman emerged victorious, those supposedly crucial urine samples were just left hanging. Lee reached out to former competitor B. Francis for advice, hoping for some solid guidance. Instead, she offered a response as useful as a wet noodle. Once a victim of IFBB politics, Francis had become a pawn in the judging system. Lee called out her advice as ignorant and a clear sign of the IFBB's disrespect for its athletes. By 1999, Lee's frustration was at its peak. Contracts were flimsy, and there were no protections for athletes. The prize money was pathetic. Lee argued that the money should be split among the lower-placing competitors who walked away empty-handed. Bodybuilding was cutthroat, and Lee wasn't in the mood for games. When he learned that judges were planning to target him based on an article he wrote, he withdrew from the show in protest. For Lee, this wasn't just about a competition. It was about fighting for the respect and livelihood of every competitor. The year 2000 might have signaled a new millennium, but for Lee Priest, nothing much changed. The bodybuilding scene was stuck in a rut, and the excitement of the sport was being replaced by burnout and frustration. What used to be impressive physiques had turned into a disturbing parade of GH guts and grotesque proportions. Priest's heart was no longer in it, and his disillusionment with the IFBB was matched by a literal heart condition that kept him sidelined for most of 2001. When Lee landed in the hospital for breathing issues, doctors found his left ventricle was only working at 40% efficiency. One doctor even warned him that continuing his training could lead to a grim fate. Unfazed, Priest discharged himself and headed straight to the gym, pushing himself to the limit on the leg press. If he survived that, he figured, he was meant to keep going. Not only did he survive, but he came back strong with solid showings in several pro contests. While he was recovering, Priest watched in shock as Daytona racer Dale Earnhardt's fatal crash made headlines. Seeing Earnhardt's last moments with his family made Priest reflect deeply on his own career, wondering if he was nearing his final lap. Facing this crossroads, he turned to drag racing and quickly made a splash by winning Rookie of the Year. This new passion gave him a fresh perspective and reinvigorated his drive. Coming back to bodybuilding, Priest was fired up and delivered strong performances in 2002, snagging second place at the Ironman and winning the San Francisco Pro. However, his frustration with the IFBB was far from over. He was baffled by why so many athletes went home empty-handed despite competing in bodybuilding's biggest event. Priest demanded clarity on where the prize money was going, and was outraged when Kevin Levrone's top-notch physique was overshadowed by a clearly inferior Ronnie Coleman. By 2003, Priest had had enough. Joe Gold's health was in decline, Vider had sold out to a bunch of corporate rookies, and Wayne DeMilia, the longtime backbone of the industry, had been ousted. To top it off, the Olympia faced its first ever financial loss. The sport was in chaos, and Lee Priest was right in the middle of it, still fighting for respect and fairness in a crumbling industry. Lee made it clear his problem wasn't with Joe Weider or Wayne DeMilia. Sure, they were tough, but they cared about the sport. The real villain was Ben Weider, the self-styled IFBB president for life. He was a pompous, power-hungry dictator, not the champion of bodybuilding he claimed to be. Things were falling apart everywhere. The old stars were fading. Wheeler and Ray were out. Ailey Burke was in a coma after tricep surgery. Marcus Rule and Kevin Levrone had torn their triceps. Art Atwood had torn a quad, and Coria had to pull out due to poor health. Lee's skepticism returned, leading to a lackluster prep and a dismal 15th place at that year's Olympia. And while competitors like Greg Kovacs and Branch Warren weren't exactly setting the world on fire, Lee felt they were no better than the new breed of freaks he despised. Lee had always appreciated extreme physiques, but these new monsters looked more like circus oddities than strongmen. The relationship with the IFBB, already strained under DeMilia, turned toxic under the new regime. Priest was slated to present an award at the 2005 Olympia, but IFBB director Robin Chang told Lee's sponsor, Twin Lab, that he wasn't even allowed on stage. Meanwhile, Wayne DeMilia was launching the Professional Bodybuilding International PDI, promising to revitalize the sport with new entertainment and judging standards. Lee eagerly joined in and won the first PDI event, only to face the IFBB's fury once again. Instead of recognizing the opportunity for a fruitful partnership, the IFBB hit back hard. Priest was banned from the 2006 Olympia. When Lee tried to congratulate Jay Cutler, the new Mr. Olympia, he was snubbed. Cutler's lame excuse was that it wouldn't look good for the Mr. Olympia to be seen talking to a banned IFBB athlete. So much for the so-called brotherhood of bodybuilding. Lee sought answers for why he was targeted, especially when others who bent the rules faced no repercussions. The IFBB's response was to double his 12-month suspension. Rival bodybuilding organizations were notoriously unstable, and DeMilia's PDI soon collapsed under pressure. Lee's world continued to unravel. After criticizing Twin Lab's supplements and dealing with missing salary issues, his contract with Muscular Development and its supplement arm was terminated by President Steve Bleckman. With bodybuilding's popularity on life support, the IFBB needed charismatic figures more than ever. They offered Lee an early reinstatement, but by then, Priest was grappling with the recent deaths of his beloved grandparents and a torn bicep. While carrying a TV, Priest's comeback hopes were dashed by bad luck, leading to his abrupt removal from the IFBB roster for life. True to form, the IFBB handled this with their usual lack of professionalism. Priest never got any official word about his lifetime ban. He only found out through the grapevine and a promoter who had to cancel his upcoming guest appearance. The IFBB blamed Priest's reluctance to compete as if he was flipping his pro card at Jim Manion. As Bob Chirell put it, Priest was banned from all IFBB-related events, expos, and even from watching shows as a spectator. He wasn't just shunned, he was practically erased from the scene. Even mentioning Priest's name was enough to earn the IFBB's wrath. Athletes like Jose Raymond, who spoke favorably about Priest, were pressured to drop the topic. Priest's sponsor, New Breed, who had shelled out $70,000 for an Olympia booth, was told they couldn't display any large banner of Priest at the event or any other IFBB show. In a sport where courage is in short supply, it's no wonder few stood by Priest in his fight for fairness and justice against an organization that exploited its athletes. It's tough to know what's going on in people's heads, but the drive for superhuman muscles is clear. Some might say Priest's stand was fueled by a Napoleon complex or a desperate need for attention, but maybe his real legacy isn't about being the biggest or the youngest pro. Maybe it's about being the one who took a stand against corruption, greed, and ignorance when everyone else stayed silent. Regardless of his reasons, Priest showed true heart, even if it hurt him personally, paving the way for better conditions for today's competitors. At the 2013 NABBA Universe, Priest had one last shot at redemption. This prestigious title, won by many past legends, was his final chance to prove he wasn't finished. Battling doubts and fears, he took home the winner's trophy and, for a brief moment, could truly call himself the master of the universe. In a world where bodybuilding often values size over substance, what does Lee Priest's story teach us about the true measure of greatness in any field? Let us know your thoughts.